Well, good morning. I'm Andy Harris. In the interest of getting started promptly, we will do that because I think we're a very interesting class this morning. First, want to just do a brief land acknowledgement that this chapel stands on lands that were owned by multiple tribes of indigenous peoples that had been on this land for thousands of years before we Europeans ever arrived. So blessings to them and to that historical text. Today, we're going to be continuing our discussion of the Doctrine of Discovery. This is our third in the series. Our speaker today is Aric Clark. Aric is a Presbyterian minister. He's an activist, community organizer, writer, blogger, and pastor of two small United Methodist churches in Sherwood. In 2016, the Presbyterian General Assembly passed a resolution calling for the Presbyterian Church to confess and repudiate its complicity in the Doctrine of Discovery. Aric is co-moderator of the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship and will be discussing current efforts by the church to address and dismantle and remediate the historical and ongoing injustices that were done by the Doctrine of Discovery. When I asked Aric to identify who he was for an introduction, this is what he said. He works for justice and repair in the church and on the street until we all get free together. So, Aric Clark.
Good morning. Thank you for being up this morning, even if it's an hour later, then it's not as early as you're used to, even for being here with me. I'm honored to be able to be part of this series, to go after some very fine teachers. I hope you took part in the other two parts of this. If not, I hear they're on the website. You should go back and watch Randy Woodley's and the other parts of it. I'm not going to rehearse what they covered, which is sort of what the Doctrine of Discovery is and all of that. I'm going to trust that you've had that introduction, or if not, that you're competent to go and get that introduction yourself. And I'm going to talk today about what is going on presently in the church, and the work that the church is doing to follow through with our commitments that we've made, having repudiated the Doctrine of Discovery, and invitations for you in ways that you can be involved in that work, in ways that Westminster, I already know, is in some ways, but other ways that Westminster can be involved in that work going forward. To start with, though, this morning, is anyone here an iPhone user? You're an iPhone user? I am an Android user. Can I see, would you mind if can I see your iPhone?
Sure.
How long have you had this iPhone?
I don't know, years.
Years? You're an iPhone guy from the beginning, back when it's there. I've been an Android guy that's there.
I
There.
remember flip phones, they weren't iPhones.
They didn't work in. What's your name?
Graham.
Graham. I just would like to acknowledge that this is Graham's phone, that Graham has stewarded and cared for this phone for years, has been an iPhone user for years, and has done a very good job. It's in excellent condition. And thank Graham for all of his years of care for this phone.
I look distracted.
Land acknowledgements are something that is a new practice, relatively speaking, new practice, that became encouraged through Canadian First Nations peoples to the church in Canada and to the government in Canada and then into Australia, and then leaked their way into the United States through similar, parallel networks, and have become a common practice. We just had one at the beginning. They are a valuable and useful practice. They are, however, just a starting place. We understand as Reformed Christians that when there is wrong that has been done, when there is harm that has been done, that there is a process that needs to be gone through for that harm to be addressed, to be repaired. However, it is nice to imagine sometimes that we can address such things with words alone. The doctrines that created the challenge that we're in, however, were not words alone, right? The Doctrine of Discovery didn't end with a statement on behalf of the church that, you know, the Christians had the right to go in and pursue land that was perceived, terra nullius, perceived as being empty, and that indigenous people didn't have the right to ownership of it and things like that. The church didn't just end with an ideological or theological statement. That ideological and theological statement had impacts in the real world. It resulted in centuries of settler colonial conquest of those territories and justification of actions of genocide, justifications of action of assimilation and erasure of native culture and native peoples and native history, of the creation of boarding school systems that attempted to eradicate native languages and native traditions and native spiritual beliefs, and break down native family systems and native lifeways. You know, all of these actions that had real impacts in the real world followed from our theological beliefs and theological commitments. Similarly, when we want to attempt to respond to and reverse those harms, when we are taking actions such as at our General Assembly, repudiating the doctrine of discovery and releasing these reports, we understand that it's not sufficient for them to be mere statements. It's not sufficient for them to be mere theological, even when the theology is profound and beautiful, even when it is as true as we can make it to be in our flawed human capacity for truth, it's insufficient for it to remain at theological commitments. It has to impact the real world. In other words, to try to put all that I've just said as simply as possible, land acknowledgements without land back don't mean very much. You all laughed because you fully understood that me acknowledging that this is Graham's phone was nowhere near good enough, right, for if I'm then just going to keep it, right? Like the acknowledgement itself doesn't do very much unless I actually return the phone to its rightful owner. Now, sometimes there are clear and direct ways we can do that, and that's wonderful when that is the case. And sometimes it's more complicated than that. What I think we have is the real work of the church in our current moment is work of imagination, of attempting to think through and be creative about how we understand what repair is, what repair even looks like, because it can look like a lot of different things. And so I'm gonna this morning talk through some things the church has done, but I'm more interested in trying to spark imagination about the possibilities for repair that exist. Because I actually find that reparative work as part of the church is some of the most profound, fruitful, life-giving, and joyful work available to us. And I mean all of those words as deeply as I can mean them. They have been all of the opportunities I have had to do reparative work as part of my ministry have been the most fulfilling parts of my vocation, and they have been genuinely joy-filled experiences. So I invite you into this work without a feeling of I'd like you to set aside guilt or shame or fear, and recognize that this is actually a profoundly joyful opportunity we have to attempt to make things whole that have been broken. And that's a great thing to get to be able to do, and very aligned with our theology as Reformed Christians, as Christians that should be among the various branches of Christianity, the most proficient at confession and repentance. It's right there, in the very top few lists of things that Reformed Christians all agree upon is the necessity of perpetual confession and repentance. So let's lean into that competency. Let's lean into that vocation we have as Reformed Christians, and figure out how we can do this well. You on board? Okay. There is a handout if you have not picked it up. It is there at the back. I'm not going to go through point by point on this because I think that it's nice to have multiple ways to get information so you can absorb some of the details of this later, particularly if you'd like to receive this in a digital form, if you can get this in email. All of these links are active links. and they're useful, so you can go through and do some self-education on some of these details there. But it has two sides. It has one side, what the church has done so far. It is a partial list, but it is attempted to be a fairly broad list of things that the church has done so far. And what we can do next is on the other side. What the church has done so far, what I want to highlight for you is that Cascades Presbytery has been involved in this very actively since this movement really reached our church, which has been about 10 years. So in about 2014, 2015, our church began thinking about, was rising into consciousness in public level, the doctrine of discovery itself, and our participation and affirmation of that doctrine historically, and how that impacted. And that resulted at the 222nd General Assembly, which was here in Portland, hosted by our presbytery, the first step in this process, which was the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery, and the commissioning of the report, which came in 2018, which is a huge document, like a 100 and some page document, detailing the history of where this doctrine came from, all of the papal bulls that were associated with it, all of the times it was affirmed by various Christian bodies, how our Christian body adopted those affirmations of other Christian bodies and incorporated it into our own thinking, how that was then transmitted into law in our country, and how that law has been repeatedly affirmed, used as precedent, and continually used up into the present moment, up into the recent day, right? We still are doing things like putting in defense appropriations bills, the rights for mineral companies to use land that is treaty land given to Native people, and justifying it on the basis of the doctrine of discovery, justifying it on the basis of court cases that used this theological concept as the legal justification for the taking of land that belongs to Native people and the use of it by non-Native people for exploitation for mineral rights or other types of purposes. That report came out in 2018, and then in 2020 they created the Native American Coordinating Council to attempt to sort of guide the church into what next steps might be. In 2018 and 2020, they put out encouragements for all mid-councils and all sessions and all church bodies to begin using land acknowledgements and to start to try to research and learn the history of their own particular land and their own particular story for how they came into possession of that land. And then in 2020 and 2022, they began to add to that the expectation that reparations would form part of this, apologies and reparations. Apologies have been made for several aspects of the church's involvement in this process. Apologies for our support of and maintenance of boarding schools and the ways that boarding schools at times furthered the cultural genocide of Native people, as well as apologies to specific groups such as the one that took place last year in Juneau, Alaska, to the Native peoples of that region, for the church basically promising that we would keep certain resources and certain mission agencies available to them, but then closing those when we decided that the tribes there no longer had enough standing to justify it, and encouraging the tribes to assimilate into the white church rather than recognizing the need for particular expression of faith that was native to their culture. And so these expressions of apologies have come with acts of reparation. Over $300,000 was given by the Presbyterian Mission Agency to these Native groups in Alaska for language recovery efforts and for land, for buying back land that had been tribal land that had, become property of other people. And so we've been trying to increasingly put our money where our mouth is, to say concretely with our resources that this is what we're going to do. And of course, individual presbyteries and bodies have also done this in their ways. In Hudson River Presbytery in New York, the Stony Point Presbyterian Church has was gifted to the Ramapo Native community there to become a community center. And you almost certainly know that here in our presbytery, We gave the land that was the former Laurelhurst Presbyterian Church to the Future Generations Collaborative for the creation of a tiny home village called Barbie's Village that is in development now. In fact, this afternoon I'm going to be over there touring the building, seeing the work they've done on the inside. They're putting cedar up everywhere inside and transforming it into a longhouse, and it's incredible the work they're doing there, and the amount of support that Future Generations Collaborative is receiving from the whole region, from the county, from the city, from the state, and from other agencies, all investing in the development of this project. It's very, very exciting to see what is going on there. And so I'm grateful to Westminster for being one of the first points of connection and advocacy for that project. And if you're not aware that your church was part of that and that the Westminster core team that was here had a lot to do with that, then get to know your people in your church better. There's been these specific instances of land back. So it's happening. It's already happening. But how can it happen more? And what is this journey that we're on? What directions is it maybe taking us in the future? For us to think about that a little bit more deeply, I want to start with some storytelling. I want to jump back in time. In 1836, a small train of settlers sponsored by the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Mission made its way across the plains and the Rocky Mountains to the Oregon Territory, as it was known at that time. And on that train were the Whitmans and the Spalding family. The Whitmans and the Spaldings were Presbyterian ministers trained by Presbyterian seminaries in bodies that antecedent to our modern PCUSA. They were ancestors of our current tradition. The American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Mission was at that time a shared mission organization between the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists in Boston area. So UCC and PCUSA in their modern forms. Our Presbyterian Mission Agency, PMA, when it was created, was literally explicitly based on that former body. Like we based our bylaws and our documents and our vision for what that agency would be on this document. So understand that these people, they're us then, right? They're our people. They came to this territory with the intent that they were going to settle among the Native American communities on the eastern side of the Cascades, the Cayuse and the modern day Umatilla, the people who the French called the Nez Perce. In English that's Nez Perce, but that's a misnomer. Their actual name is the Nimipu people, which sort of are eastern Oregon, Washington, and Idaho territory. And they were going to settle among those people, and they were going to attempt to convert them to Presbyterianism, to Calvinist Christianity, because not only the general conviction that conversion of people who aren't Christian was important, but because they believed that settlement of these territories by white settlers was impending, it was going to happen, and that when it did happen, that Native people would be displaced by the settlers, but less so if those Native people were already Christianized. In other words, these missionaries were coming to Christianize the natives of this region. They were trying to beat the wave of settlers to get ahead of them, to Christianize these indigenous people here in the hopes that, having been Christianized, these Native Americans would have a better chance at retaining claim to their land over the settlers that would be coming. So there was an ostensibly charitable, noble idea behind this, though framed in a paternalistic sort of way, framed in the way that like we have the knowledge and the truth, we have the right ideas, and we can save you or protect you from this harm. This harm, which by the way was perceived as inevitable, like there was nothing anyone could do about it, that it was going to happen, and that, you know, the best we could hope for Native people out here was, you know, an accommodation being made for their survival against this tide, this wave of settlement. The Native people who received them did not particularly appreciate this paternalistic approach of the Whitmans and the Spaldings. Spalding himself had a little bit more success in his region, mostly due to his wife Eliza being a very good linguist, and she learned the Nimapu, the Ne Perce language, and was able to communicate well with them. The Whitmans seemingly never took interest in learning any of the languages of the people that were here, wanted them to learn English, and did succeed in teaching some of them English, but largely seemed mostly to find frustration being among the Cayuse people because of what the Whitmans perceived as Cayuse superstition, Cayuse religious beliefs that were, you know, they didn't approve of. The Whitmans had, he was a doctor, he was a physician by training experience, and he tried to practice his medical practice with the Cayuse people. Of course, at the time, his practice was a belief in the humors of the four humors of the body and the need to use leeching and bleeding as a treatment for basically most kinds of ailments, treatments that we now know are completely ineffective as part of that. But by being among the Cayuse, they transmitted the measles to the Cayuse people, and the Whitman children who had, you know, a genetic and exposure to these things were more inoculated. The white children of the Whitman plantation and mission largely survived this measles outbreak, while the Cayuse children did not. Dr. Whitman did try to treat everyone using the same treatments that were as equally ineffective in both cases. Bleaching did not cure the measles for the white kids any more than it cured the measles for the Native kids. But because of his attempt to use his medical practice in doing so, and he had been multiple times warned about this, among the Cayuse there was a tradition, a belief that if a medicine person, if a doctor, you know, fails to cure patients, then they are responsible for the deaths of those patients. The Cayuse told the Whitmans to get out of the land, to leave. The Whitmans refused, and it escalated to a point of violence where eventually the Whitmans were killed by some Cayuse men who came and executed the family. Spalding took this story and added to it. There's one other little detail of this story. A couple years before the death, so they came out here in 1836, and it was in 1847, so a little over a decade that they were at their mission out in eastern Oregon, and that during that time, in the middle of that time, the American Board for Missions saw that they were being ineffective, that they weren't achieving any of the goals of conversion that had been set, and basically tried to call them back, tried to say, let's end this, you come back to Boston, we'll send a different group, or we'll try a different method. And Whitman didn't want to, he wanted to continue his mission, so he got on a horse and he rode in wintertime from the Whitman plantation, the Whitman mission, across the country, back to DC and Boston to go advocate with the Board of Missions for the right for them to continue funding the mission. He succeeded and was encouraged, and then on his way back, he joined with the first large wagon train. This was 1843, the first large wagon train of settlers that was coming to the Oregon Territory, and because he had personal experience, having been there, he served as a guide for them, and he guided them into the territory. And as he guided them into the territory, he basically got a new sense of his mission, his calling. He decided that his role was no longer caring for the Cayuse or trying to convert the Cayuse, but it was going to basically be to help the white settlers who were coming to settle into the land, to settle in and to find things in Oregon. So the mission became kind of a stopping point on the Columbia before people would get further, before they get down to like Fort Vancouver and the Willamette Valley. They would stop at the Whitman Ranch, at the Whitman mission, and the Whitmans would give them medical care and food and tell them all about what the dangers further down the river and give them all the advice. So hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of white people in those 4 years between 1843 and 1847 were coming through Cayuse territory and stopping in the Whitman Ranch and being there. And the Cayuse basically correctly perceived that the Whitman mission was not there to help them, but was there to help this process of settlement. And so the Cayuse said, we no longer give you permission to be on our land anymore, don't stay here. And it escalated and escalated until then that measles outbreak happened right at the end, as the Whitmans were refusing to leave, had been asked multiple times to leave and refusing to leave. And then the Cayuse tradition of saying a medicine man is responsible for his patients, and if your patients die, then you have to go, don't join them in death. So they killed the Whitmans. Well, Henry Spalding took this story of the Whitmans and he turned it into a sensation in the newspapers. He was a very potent writer. Presbyterians have a tradition of being, really good with the written word, and he was good at that. He wrote for lots of newspapers and lots of mission societies back east, and it was exactly the sort of sensational Western story that people in the East were interested in hearing, and he wrote about it, and he embellished Whitman's ride to the back to Boston and claimed essentially that Whitman knew that had some personal insight that the Oregon Territory and the West that the British were going to try and claim it, that they were going to try and steal it from the Americans. And as such, that the reason for his ride wasn't to get funding for his mission, but was to go to DC to implore the president to send as many settlers as possible to the Oregon Territory so that the Americans could keep the British from stealing it from us. And so Whitman became an national American hero for decades through the early parts of the 20th century, up into the 1950s and 60s. Whitman there were statues of him in Boston and DC and St. Louis, and school plays about him. Kids would tell the story of the Whitman massacre and the Whitman story, because Whitman, his ride was like a new Paul Revere's ride, right? It was an attempt by a patriotic American to save American land from invading British enemies. And Spalding perpetuated this blatant untruth as a means of him continuing to get funding for his mission in Idaho, because his mission was also failing, and he wanted more attention from the churches in the East to send money for there. That story became the major fundraising drive for the Whitman University, the Whitman College that there now exists. For decades, it was how that university fundraised for itself, on the idea that they were continuing this American story and this American legacy of this American hero who died a martyr to vicious murder by Native Americans, but who, before he died, managed to save the Oregon Territory for Americans. And in other words, you can look, and if you look go to the library, you can probably find a dozen books that are about how the Whitmans saved Oregon, and that Oregon exists today because of the Whitmans. All right, storytelling time over, long story. But here's why I spent a little time on that story. Here we are, we're in Oregon, we're Oregonians. This story is the kind of mythology and story making that has enabled and encouraged the settlement of this region, and formed the identity of this region. And it centers on and was created by Presbyterians. Whitman was a Presbyterian and Spalding was a Presbyterian. So the central character of the story is a Presbyterian, and the person who wrote it and created it was a Presbyterian. And it was done so for the reasons of them wanting to keep funding for their own missions, but then consequentially added to the sort of patriotic fervor of a nation that wanted heroes and martyrs and stories that they could use for the justification of the conquest of a land and territory, a conquest which was genocidal. The Cayuse was the first war in this area, which involved a militia being raised at Fort Vancouver in Oregon City. At the time, the U.S. federal government said, we're not going to send troops out your way, it's too far, and we're not interested in sending troops, and we're not doing it. So you know what our hero Spalding did? He took $500 of American Board of Missions money, church money, and he used it to outfit the militia to buy guns and horses for the militia so that the militia could go and attack the Cayuse to take the land from the Cayuse, which would be about $20,000-ish in modern money if we were making an allowance for inflation of time. So church money to fund a militia, church resources to create these missions in the first place, and then church energy behind the endowments which made the Whitman College and the things which perpetuated in the aftermath of all of that. It's the Presbyterian Church that has some responsibility for that. So when we think about repair, one way for us to start to move into that imaginative concept of repair is to try to make these connections as concrete as we can make them, and as specific as we can imagine them, to connect the past with the present and to see that the past is hardly even past, that it isn't distant from us at all, but that these realities are still the case. So, for example, the Lapwai mission in Idaho, which is where Spalding's mission was, the Lapwai area there still has, the Lapwai National Park still has a memorial and monument to Spalding at where his house and where his ranch was, that is maintained not by the federal government, but by the Presbyterian Historical Society. The plaques and historical memorials and things that are there, they are funded, they were put there and they're funded by the Presbyterian Historical Society. The federal government allows us to do so because it's, they don't mind someone else paying for things to be there as part of that. And so the modern institutions that exist are directly connected to and descended from the institutions that were there in the past. So if $500 of Presbyterian mission money was used for the creation of a militia or for the arming of a militia that was to do harm against the Cayuse, and that would be $20,000 in present terms, then what if our Presbyterian Mission Agency was to give $20,000 of reparations at least? Maybe we figure out what downstream effects we might want to add to that, but figure out that as a way of saying our money was misused to harm you, and we are thinking about how we ought to, make repair for that kind of situation. Or what if we were to ask the Presbyterian Historical Society to partner with the Nez Perce or the Nimiipuu people of that region, and to ask for how would they like the story to be told at the Spalding, mission site? What plaques and memorials and stories are suitable? What are correct? What is the version of the story that makes sense from their perspective? Since we have up to now only told it from our perspective and from the perspective of the mission agencies that were sponsoring Spalding's mission. Or what if we were to look around to all of the churches and sites in the Pacific Northwest that have a room in their church or a space in their building somewhere that's named Whitman or Spalding, and we were to think about what those spaces represent, not necessarily asking that we rename them necessarily, but just thinking about what those spaces represent and how those spaces are to be used. What are we going to do with the narrative that we have inherited, that we have that we have treated as though this is what the story means, and now we're beginning to understand that the story has other meanings to Native peoples, and how are we going to retell that story in a new way for ourselves and for our communities around us? And what are we going to do with the resources that have been accumulated in respect to those things? Because usually when we name a memorial or we create a memorial, there's some sort of fund attached to it, or some sort of endowment, or connected resources that are often attached to such things. What are we doing with those funds, with those endowments? What are we doing with those memorialization of certain figures and people from our past? I don't want to make this all about the Whitmans and the Spaldings, or try to transform any individual into to a hero or a villain. But what I did want to do is just try to help us in the exercise of taking something concrete and figuring out how it has connected to from the past into the present moment, and to see where we can begin to then go, okay, here is a concrete aspect of our story that we can get a hold of and begin to figure out how to respond in a reparative way in our present moment. One last example from the Spalding and Whitman story. That militia eventually, after a couple years of back and forth war with the Cayuse, managed to get 5 Cayuse men surrendered by the Cayuse tribe that were put through basically a show trial in Oregon City. The trial was pretty terrible circumstances in terms of jurisprudence. It's not a good example of healthy jurisprudence, but put through a show trial in Oregon City, hung and then buried in unmarked graves in Oregon City. We don't actually know where their bodies are. The Cayuse have been asking ever since for their remains to be returned for proper burial. There, I say we don't know where they are, but there are some possibilities that archaeologists could follow up on. Does the Presbyterian Church have the will, the interest, or the resources to fund an archaeological investigation to attempt to recover the remains of the Cayuse 5 and to return them, repatriate them, or rematriate them to their people, that they can be properly interred, so that this story of violence between Native Americans and Presbyterians in the Pacific Northwest can start to have some redemption at the end of it, instead of perpetuating stereotypes and feuding centuries old at this point? If you're interested in more detail, I think well worth your time, this book, Murder at the Mission, is by Blaine Harden. It's a journalistic investigation of the Whitman and Spalding story that uses, like if you look through all of his notes at the back, it's our Presbyterian Historical Society. We have all of Spalding and Whitman's letters. These men were very prolific writers. So we have all of their letters between them and the mission boards back east, explaining their reasoning for why they were doing what they were doing. So if it sounded like some of what I was saying was like speculation on motive and things like that, you can read it in their own words if you'd like to hear why Spalding did what he did, why Whitman did what he did, and you'd like to read and hear what they did. Their letters are available, and this book puts it together in a very accessible way. So the author is Blaine Harden, and it's called Murder at the Mission. If you want to see afterwards, I can, you can come up and get a closer look. All right, that's enough of me talking at you. What I've tried to do is to give you some examples of what the church has been doing, and then to say, if we want to engage in this reparative work, the task is a task of imagination. We want to connect our past, we want to understand our past as well as we can, and we want to connect our past with the present and figure out how it echoes and reverberates now, and how we can take those echoes and reverberations and turn them toward healing and turn them toward redemption. I tried to give you an example using the Whitman and Spalding story that's local to our region there. But what I'd like to do now is open it up to, any questions or you have, but also any points of imagination, any bits of storytelling that you're familiar with, perhaps specific to Westminster, that where your imagination begins to fire about how our history can be used to inform our efforts to do reparative work in the present. So, I see one hand going up there at the back. Hi.
Yeah, hi. I came in a little bit late, sorry. Just thank you so much for filling in a lot of gaps, I think that at least, I had in my understanding. I have a couple of questions. One is about, the way that the whole Barbie's Village situation happened, and yes, they have the church now, but I remember the trustees saying very clearly, we don't ever want to do this again. So just because we had this one transaction doesn't mean it's just, one and done. I think that a lot of change needs to happen in the relationships, and we have a group here at the church that's trying to work on those relationships, not just, with future generations, collaborative. But I guess one question is how do we think about those, the church as a whole thinking more than just giving back a building or the money, and then,
Well, keep that second question. I'll address it there, but this is good. Yeah, excellent. So on the back of your sheet, I had some what we can do next, and that third point, advocating for policies of repair and land liberation, is really important. And you're exactly right that the Barbie's Village process resulted in a very good outcome, but in the process, conflict was surfaced within our presbytery. Always will when you try to talk about land and money. Always will. Long experience as an organizer in the church. Everything looks fine on the surface until you try and get people to talk seriously about money, and then you'll realize where the divisions and conflicts lie. So I'm not surprised that conflict did arise, but part of that conflict is some sense from some people that reparations is counter to the health and longevity of the church because it's taking resources from the church to something else, and therefore a resistance to it. What I think is going to be important if we want reparations to be part of our long-term process, if we want to be committed to reparations, is for us to cultivate culture and policies which are measurable and we can be held accountable to, that commit us to this long-term. And so what I'm hoping will happen, and I don't know specifically how this will play out, but what I'm hoping will happen is that we'll start to see churches and presbyteries and synods do, for example, what the Synod of Lakes and Prairies has done in Minnesota, which it committed to a proportional, meaning equal, amount of any future bequests or resources gained from sale of property going to Native Americans or Afro-American communities who have been harmed by the church from now going forward. So in other words, if you give $100,000 to the Synod of Lakes and Prairies today, $50,000 of that will be going to Afro-American or Native American groups as an act of reparations for that, and that is a policy they've committed to going forward. Already $400 and some thousand has been given out of that body for this work going forward. And that kind of policy puts teeth on it and says, this is what we're committing to, this is how we understand this isn't a one-time thing, but that this is a part of who we are. This is a part of how we move in the world. So that's in response to that first question. I'm sure there's more, and go ahead, you had a second.
Yeah, it was just related to that, just thinking about Whitman College. I almost ended up going there and just thinking about that institution, just kind of what's it gonna do, like rename itself, and how does it reshape? So I mean, I'm sure that's not the only, institution that Presbyterians created, that now we have to, kind of be real and say, okay, what really happened, and how do we make this better, not just with money, but with the people that we dominated over those years. Just your thoughts.
Yeah. The last chapter of this book actually gets a little bit into what's going on at Whitman College. You might not be surprised that the newest generations of students are not thrilled about inheriting this legacy, and that they're quite active in attempting to figure out how to wrestle with and undo, including some of the memorials that are on the campus at the Whitman College and what those memorials say about what the college believes, who they are and what they believe about themselves. There have been some scholarship funds created specifically for Native Americans, specifically for Cayuse and Umatilla students to attend free at Whitman College, which is one potential avenue that's being explored. I think another potential avenue to be explored is that one of the things that's nice about all of this record keeping from all these people who love the written word. We Presbyterians, boy, we're good at that. We love the written word. We keep records well, which means that we can actually add it up. We can look back and go, how much was given by churches? How big were those endowments? How big were those funds that we created for colleges like Whitman to exist? And then what does that mean? I mean, again, reparations doesn't always come down to a one-to-one mathematically, but it isn't a bad place to start with thinking about how do we quantify the harm that's been done insofar as it is quantifiable. Of course, it's not always so, but insofar as we can think about that, how do we then begin to respond? What would be a pathway toward repair? If I've taken your phone and I give you your phone back and I've made you whole again, now if I take your phone and I broke it into its component pieces and I give you back all the component pieces, it's not the same, obviously. So then I have to start to think about what am I going to be able to do to how to make this right. Maybe I need to go buy you a new phone that's, to replace what was lost. And obviously when we're talking about human lives, there's no dollar value that can be placed. But we can think about this in terms of relationships and how our actions will promote better relationships going forward. How, if the harm that was done was a harm fundamentally between people groups, and it created division and created injury and created separation and lasting pain between those people groups, how are our reparative actions going to move us into a new way of being in relationship with each other where the next generation's experience of that relationship will be recovered from, or at least recovering from, that harm that was done. Any other questions, comments, thoughts?
Comment and question. Our oldest child graduated from Whitman in 2008, and so this is fascinating. I was somewhat familiar because we visited the mission. I read Narcissa's diaries where she kind of went mad, when her daughter drowned. And she was so high-minded in the beginning, and then it ended so horribly for her. So I'm going to share this with our daughter and a few of her friends. So that's my comment. My question is, you being a Presbyterian trained, although you're with Methodist churches, do you know what the Presbytery is doing, or maybe somebody else here does, or maybe this church, we're new to the church, vis-a-vis Warm Springs?
Actually, there's a very recent update on that. There is a church in the Warm Springs reservation that has been there. It's just celebrated its 150th anniversary this summer. It is one of several mission churches that were created by the churches in the Western regions. Basically, when the Native people in Oregon and Washington and other places were forced onto reservations by the federal government, the different church bodies basically divided up the different reservations and said, we'll take responsibility for this one, you've got that one, you've got that, blah, 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 blah. So in Oregon, the Presbyterians took responsibility for Warm Springs, which meant that, at the time, it meant that we were going to attempt to convert them and save their souls. But it also meant that we were going to try and provide a place for community gathering and food and some resources to the community that is often a deeply, deeply under-resourced community. One of those apologies that happened in 2022, or actually it was just last year in Alaska, was actually an apology from the Presbyterian Church to a Native community for closing that mission church and for taking away the resources that the Presbyterian Church had essentially promised in perpetuity to the Native people. We said, for accepting this displacement to this reservation, we owe you a perpetual spiritual home and a site of connection and resources from the church if you want to. And we made these commitments. So just yesterday at Presbytery in Ashland. The Presbytery voted by a motion of the trustees to recommit to what we had. In concrete, that means refurbishing the church building in the parsonage, providing funds for a local native person to be trained in ministry and to be supported, their salary supported in ministry there, and then for the site to be a Presbyterian disaster assistance hub, which will provide, food, water, whatever sorts of things are needed out of that community center there, per the request of the people in that place. It is a complicated dynamic because these churches were created under the same theological vision that, that sponsored the Doctrine of Discovery and Manifest Destiny, right? Like, they were not initially created as an attempt to build long-lasting, healthy relationships between equals, where Native people were perceived as having their own valid spiritual traditions and cultures and languages. They were in the same paternalistic mode as the Whitmans when they were created. Nevertheless, they have been one of the only places where Presbyterians or Methodists or other people in different cases have actually often been in relationship with Native people. And for many Native people, it's their primary way of understanding the church and knowing what the church is. So it's a bit complicated because on the one hand, we don't want to continue the paternalistic top-down mentality of mission that says we're coming to save you. We're not in the business of trying to take away Native culture and language anymore, and should not be. But at the same time, we don't want to break fellowship and break relationships that have, a century and a half of history, and upon which many members of the Native community depend. So we're trying to figure out how to do this well. And we're trying to do that by elevating Native leadership and decentering white Presbyterian leadership and saying, okay, the Warm Springs Church is going to have to be something a little different than what it was, but we're going to financially support it open-endedly for years to come, hoping that we can figure out how to make this relationship a better one. Yeah.
In January, Jim Wiesel, who most everybody here knows,
Yeah.
is going to be speaking on that very topic at our adult education.
Good.
He chaired the commission that came up with whatever the
Yep.
vote was yesterday in Presbytery.
Yeah. Loved it.
So we'll learn a lot more about that.
Hasn't there been some movement in the discovery of the 5 that were unjustly executed and buried?
So I know that the Oregon, the Oregon Trail Museum, there's a museum in Oregon City. I know that they have had for a while a plaque and a donation site saying we're trying to raise the funds to do some more archaeological research. I don't know if there's been any recent move on that but I'd be happy to be educated about that. If you read an article somewhere or see that there's some change in the process, it's one of those things that's like, it just needs the community will. Like the historians and archaeologists are like, there's 2 or 3 probable sites. There's not that many. Oregon City at that time wasn't a big place. It's not really likely to be that difficult, but it's just to gather up the resources and the community will. And it's one of those things that is also, people in the community don't necessarily want to face it, like there's some energy towards saying, can we just leave things in the past, because it's going to be painful to dig up the fact that the first execution in Oregon was a sort of show trial of 5 Native people, which, by the way, was the legal justification that Lincoln later used for the hanging of the Dakota 48. I don't know if you've heard of the largest mass execution in American history was execution of Dakota Native men during the Civil War period by Abraham Lincoln, and his justification was, well, they did it in Oregon, we can do it in Minnesota. So that's That's unfortunately, I hate to, I know that's not like a cheery note to start you're going into worship on, but these stories are our stories. They're part of our history, and so we've got to figure out how to bring them to a better ending. Yeah.
As far as the Warm Springs Church, our former pastor, David Hutchinson, is preaching over there today, and Dan Better, one of our choir members, is doing music for them.
Great.
So our congregation is
Personal relationships being
involved with that.
perfect. Yeah, and you can go and worship with them. I mean, go out to Madras. It's beautiful. Go out to Madras on a Sunday morning, and worship with them sometime. I'll be preaching there in December and February, and I know a lot of other folks in our presbytery are trying to rebuild those relationships and invest in that community. Yeah, well, sir.
The idea that we would take the rate of inflation and turn 500 into 20,000, and we'd give them 20,000 for reparations, misses an important point, which is that it's really cheap to destroy something. You brought it up with breaking this into all of its constituent. All you have to do is hit it with a hammer. It's
Yeah.
not expensive. And I noticed you deleted all that content. But is there any serious thinking about the difference between what it costs to wreck things and what it would cost to rebuild them? I mean, giving me back my phone was cheap.
Right.
It was about equal to
Right.
what it cost to take it.
Yeah, and part of that is because no damage had been done, but also because it was close in time, right? Like I only kept it for a few minutes. We're dealing with things that sometimes decades or a couple generations have passed, and so that complicates the how does one deal with pay. I think so on the back of your sheet here, I gave you 4 things which are not meant to be a step 1, 2, 3, 4. Nevertheless, there is a kind of flow here. So the first thing is sort of like the study phase, like crafting a land genealogy, getting to know your particular history, getting to know what actually happened on this land in the past, how we got this land, who was excluded, all of those sorts of things as we do that. Getting to get as concrete. That's kind of what I was trying to do with telling a specific story about the Spaldings and the Whitmans, getting concrete with our history. But step 2 is get into relationship with the currently existing descendants of those people in whatever way you can. And I give you some examples of some ways. Fortunately, Native American survivance is powerful, and they are not gone. They are here. They are among us in many vital ways. You can build relationships with the Future Generations Collaborative, or with NEA, or with Grand Ronde, or with Warm Springs, and a variety of ways that you can do that. But that relationship step is kind of the answer to the second part, which is to say, ask. Like, build relationships. Like, I think what ultimately, insofar as there is an answer to some of these things, the answer is for Whitman College and the Cayuse to get together and talk and go, what do we owe the Cayuse people? What do the Cayuse think we owe the Cayuse people? What do and that isn't something as well that can be answered in a single question. It actually has to be unfolded in time, because we don't there's a lot of understandable mistrust, confusion. There's a lot of tendency to for that to fall back into familiar patterns, which are destructive of sort of top-down we're coming to save you sort of mentality. That for this to work, it has to be mutual, it has to be relational. We have to ask, like, slowly over time with each other, how is our relationship going to be different? And of course that includes an element of repair, of straight up making wrongs right. But the how of making them right is going to depend. And it's going to depend upon what we hope for from those relationships 5 years, 10 years, 7 generations from now.
I want to thank you about the background, the history, and I witnessed since I'm almost 15, 16 years in this country, and I saw somebody created the formula in the 1800s. At that time, only white and Native American. Now more immigrants came, like African American or Irish American, whatever immigrants. Now the same formula, they use it in the old days with newspaper. Now they use it with social media, which rewire people's mind about repeating the lie until they believe. Like, as myself, I'm first generation immigrants, I witnessed these things like false accusation, something bad about whoever person different, either minorities like immigrants or LGBTQ or whatever. And this formula is continuing, with people believe whatever they hear from the news or social thing. But if the person is not well educated, she or he, they cannot understand the history. But now I see it more clear after you explain. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. So I'll offer just one last word. I know we are coming to our time, and if any of you want to stay, I'll be here. I'm not leaving. I'm gonna also stay for worship, so you can come up to me and talk to me at any point. But to just answer that, the church is in an interesting place, which is that we, maybe in the mid 1800s, the church had a fair amount of power. Socially speaking, right now, the church is not in the powerful place it was at that time. But to understand that our connection and relationship to these dynamics in some ways is still similar, which is that the motivation for taking this land was crass, settler colonial imperialism. It was wealth. It was people trying to build new lives for themselves. The literal land donation, the Donation Land Claim Act was literally free land for white people, Christian white folks, and some partially Native folks. As a kind of like power grab. The church didn't do that. The church provided the narrative and the justification and the rationale for how people could live with themselves for doing that. So even though we don't have power nowadays in that sense, we still do have this narrative making power. We still do have this storytelling power. We still do provide moral and rational justifications to people for how and why they ought to be in the world and still be able to sleep at night, still be able to think of themselves as a good person. So the story that we ought to tell is a story that encourages people to understand that the relationship we need to have with each other, and this includes, outsiders and oppressed groups of every kind and type, of refugees and immigrants coming from various places, and houseless folks and Native folks and African American people and people who have been put down in various ways by society, largely for extractivist monetary gain at their expense, is that the church needs to tell a narrative that says that you can't live with yourself for participating in this, and that we ought to see our obligation to care for each other as liberating and joyful, because that story is a story that will inspire. That story is a story that will help our next several generations hopefully not be having to be doing this kind of painful excavating of our own history and our own complicity in darkness, but instead be able to celebrate how we have in fact repaired harms and healed wrongs and made right. I think we can do it, and I hope we will do it. Thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you, Aric, for bringing us up to date, even to yesterday's meeting of the Presbytery. We can't be more up to date than that, so thank you all.
Sure, yes. Okay.